Ember's Wake, Book 1. The Lost Son, Chapter 3. The Old Man and the Boy. Kaelen never knew where he came from. He simply appeared one day, a tiny presence amid the sprawling decay of the hollow, a forgotten world marred by the relentless advance of time. He had no memory of parents, only an ever-present nagging sensation that he didn't belong, like a misplaced puzzle piece in a worn-out picture. The tender warmth of a mother's embrace enveloping him in an aura of unconditional love, and the firm, reassuring grip of a father's guiding hands, always there to steer him through life's challenges. These were sensations he could scarcely fathom. In this harsh, metallic landscape, he was an enigma, without family, without identity, without even a name to call his own. The other children, their faces smudged with grime, called him rat or scum, their cruel taunts reverberating through the narrow, echoing corridors, harsh reminders of his insignificance. All he truly understood amid the clanking machinery and whispering winds was the relentless ache of hunger that gnawed at him day and night. It had always been a part of Kaelen's life. At first, it was manageable. Just another ache, like the bruises from sleeping on coal metal or the burning in his throat after drinking from stagnant water. He had learned to ignore it, to push it down until something edible came along. Scraps could be found if one searched hard enough. A rat slow enough to catch. A ration pack tossed aside with only half its contents eaten. Stale water pooled in the indent of a rusted plate. It was never quite sufficient, always leaving a sense of longing and incompleteness. Yet it was still something. A small, flickering light in the vast expanse of darkness. The hollow was never generous, but back then it wasn't suffocating either. Food had existed, hidden in the corners of the ruined city, just out of reach, but never impossible to find. Metallic winds whispered through the alleys, rattling loose panels like broken chimes. Everything felt vast and empty, spaces between the ruins stretching out beneath the shadow of forgotten towers. Kaelen had known this version of the hollow, the one that held secrets if you knew where to look, if you knew how to move through it unseen. He had learned from an early age that silence and patience were the best tools, and he used them well. The hollow had always been cruel, but cruelty had rules, twisted, unwritten laws that dictated who lived, who suffered, and who vanished. There was a time, not long ago, when the city was still quiet in its decay, when the ruins stretched empty and vast, where the only sound was the distant hum of broken machines and the cautious whispers of those who had managed to carve out a space for themselves. It was brutal, but it was predictable. That world no longer existed. Now the streets swarmed with bodies, a tide of the desperate and starving, drawn here by necessity rather than hope. They had not come because the hollow offered refuge, but because the world outside had left them no choice. Out there, nothing remained, only wastelands choked with poison, lands scarred by war, and skies heavy with storms that never broke. No food, no shelter, no future. The hollow was the last step before oblivion, a final rotting foothold before the fall. Kaelen moved through the chaos like a ghost, slipping unseen between those who had yet to learn how to vanish. Their faces blurred together, gaunt, hollow-eyed, some young, some old, all carrying the weight of the lives they had lost before they even arrived. They packed into whatever spaces they could find, turning ruined buildings into crumbling sanctuaries, fighting over scraps of food, over water, over the mere illusion of a future. But there was no future here, only survival. The hollow did not embrace its newcomers, It consumed them. It took everything they had left, their strength, their dignity, their last desperate hopes, and when they had nothing more to give, it left them to rot. And yet, they kept coming. The upper levels of the ruins became a festering hive, bodies packed so tight that even the air struggled to escape. The stench of sweat, filth, and decay clung to everything. Makeshift fires smouldered in the alleys, fed by whatever scraps of refuse could still burn. Fights erupted over the smallest things. A sip of clean water, a torn jacket, a place to sleep where the rain wouldn't reach. And watching it all, feeding on the desperation, were the warlords. They had ruled the Hollow before, but now they thrived. Each fresh wave of arrivals was another chance to tighten their grip, to expand their reach. They took what they wanted: rations, weapons, bodies. Their men prowled the streets like scavengers, stripping the weak of anything useful. Those who had nothing to give were turned into labor, working until they collapsed, or thrown into the pit fights to entertain the crowds. And still, they kept coming. Kaelen watched from the shadows, unseen. He had no illusions of what was coming next. The ones who arrived with hope would lose it first. The ones who arrived with nothing would become the most dangerous of all. The Hollow had never been a refuge. It had always been a graveyard, just one where the dead still walked. With each passing cycle, fewer scraps remained. Scavenging became warfare. A child snatching a piece of bread meant a blade in the ribs. A weak hand reaching for discarded fruit meant broken fingers, or worse. It was no longer about survival. It was about who could take, who could hold, and who was willing to become something worse just to see another day. Kaelen learned to be quicker, to anticipate where the competition might be fiercest and where he might slip through unseen. His body, always lean, became more angular, more bone than flesh, more hunger than boy. He felt the shift, the slow tightening of the city around him, as if it were drawing in its breath and waiting for something to break. The ones in control, if they could even be called rulers, kept everything for themselves. Not even the illusion of fairness existed anymore. The strong hoarded, and the desperate begged. Kaelen never begged. He searched harder, slipping through tight alleyways, rummaging through debris that had long since been picked clean. Even the bones of the city had been gnawed down to nothing. He found pockets of space that others hadn't discovered yet, hidden corners where he could curl up and catch his breath, places to hide and listen, places to move when everyone else was still. He felt the Hollow's rhythms, knew its pulse, and used it to stay one step ahead, but it was getting harder. The distance between meals grew longer, his movements slower. The constant pressure in his gut turned from a sharp, barking pain to a low, constant throb that settled deep inside him. His body, once restless, grew sluggish. He could feel himself hollowing out. Hunger wasn't just an ache anymore. It was a sickness, clawing at his ribs, making his thoughts foggy, turning his limbs into dead weight. And still, he searched. It was the only thing he knew how to do. It was the only way to survive. Each breath felt like glass against his lungs, each step a war with gravity. He drifted between awareness and something darker, something deeper, the world around him slowing into a dreamlike haze. Had it been 2 days since he last ate? 3, longer? The numbers had blurred together into something meaningless. Kaelen stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. His frame was thin enough to slip through any gap, but it didn't feel like a gift anymore. It felt like an anchor, dragging him down with each heartbeat. He found a patch of darkness that was thick enough to hide him and folded himself into it, knees pulled tight against his chest. He waited, let his mind wander, let himself fall. The hollow did not tolerate the weak, and Kaelen was becoming weak. A sound cut through the haze, low, steady, deliberate. Kaelen's body tensed instinctively. Movement meant danger. A figure stood at the edge of the alley. Broad shoulders, a coat worn from age and use, a slow, deliberate stance. He did not move like the others. There was no tension in his posture, no nervous glances over his shoulder, no restless hands ready to grab or strike. But that didn't make him safe. The hollow had no safe men. Kaelen pressed himself deeper into the shadows, willing himself invisible. The man sighed, the sound heavy with something Kaelen couldn't name. He crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, leveling his gaze toward the boy, without moving closer. "You planning to live in that crate forever, boy?" The figure spoke with a warmth in his voice, a tone he only knew when the sun peeked through the city's smog. Kaelen didn't answer, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The man's face was etched with deep wrinkles, the result of a lifetime of experience. His beard, once a dark brown, was now flecked with strands of silver that added to his rugged appearance. His eyes were piercing and seemed to hold infinite knowledge as they swept over Kaelen, evaluating him with a sharpness that hinted at a lifetime of observation. Despite the severity of his gaze, there was no hint of malice or cruelty in his expression. But Kaelen had learned long ago that kindness was often the sharpest knife. The man exhaled again, not impatient, not demanding, just there. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the ground between them. Food. Kaelen's stomach twisted. This was a trick. It was always a trick. But the man did not move. He didn't offer coaxing words, didn't try to lure Kaelen out. He only sat there for a moment longer, studying him, then pushed himself back to his feet. "Suit yourself." The man patted his coat, and just like that, he rose to his full height, turning with a calmness that belied the brutal world around them. His footsteps echoed softly in the alleyway, fading into the sounds of the hollow, each step deliberate yet unhurried. Kaelen watched, his instinct screaming that there was something wrong, that this was not how the hollow worked. No one left without taking something. No one gave without expecting more in return. But this man walked away, leaving the food and leaving Kaelen to question everything. Leaving him with a gesture so alien it felt like a threat. Kaelen remained frozen long after the man was gone. Kaelen remained frozen long after the man was gone. Hunger warred with mistrust inside him, and each time it felt like one might win, the other reared up with renewed strength, clawing at him from the inside out. This was not the first time he had been baited, and it wouldn't be the first time he was caught. But the man had been alone, no signs of others waiting to grab him. Kaelen watched the alley, eyes darting, waiting for the slightest flicker of movement. All he saw was rust, the city's breath staining everything a burnt orange, everything still. This was how they got you. This was how they made you think it was safe. But nothing was safe here. The silence stretched long enough to be sure. Kaelen's fingers twitched against the metal floor beneath him. They found nothing but cold emptiness. His stomach clenched, empty as well. It was not safe. It would never be safe. The decision wasn't a decision at all, just a moment where something broke loose inside him. Maybe it was the hunger, clawing with teeth sharper than reason. Maybe it was the thing in him that still wanted to believe, no matter how many times he had tried to kill it. His hand shot out, moving on its own, thin fingers closing around the food, like it might vanish if he didn't act fast enough. He pulled it to him, unwrapped it with movements that were more animal than boy. Then he ate, and the food was real, a solid weight in his stomach, an anchor against the doubt that gnawed at him even as he chewed. He swallowed and waited for the rest of the trap, waited for the sounds of footsteps rushing toward him, for the shadows to split open and swallow him whole. But there was nothing except the sound of his own breath coming hard and fast, and the echo of the food as it hit his gut. It felt like swallowing a stone, like taking in something more than his shrunken body could hold. He kept eating, knowing it was never the first bite that got you. It was the second, the third, the moment when you thought the world might not be what you knew it to be. He kept eating, and this time he allowed himself to hope the trap would never spring. He didn't expect the old man to come back, just like he didn't expect the world to be anything other than what it had already shown him. Hope was a whisper that cut the flesh, leaving only scars. Any thought of the old man's return was likely a trick, even if it was a trick he was playing on himself. Kaelen told himself that this was normal, that the food had been a fluke, some leftover scrap the man wanted rid of, something that would never happen again. But hunger was patient. It knew how to crouch and wait, how to burrow in until it forced you to act against everything you knew to be true. Hunger was a brutal kind of patience, and so was routine. But so was routine, and that was why he found himself back in the same place, tucked deep within the shadows, listening, feeling the weight of anticipation as his stomach turned in empty circles. He knew this was a trap, knew that nothing repeated itself in the hollow unless it was part of some larger and more dangerous pattern. But he also knew that the ache in him didn't care about patterns or danger. It only cared about filling the void. The footsteps returned, the same time, the same pace. He heard them before he saw them, low and steady on the metal floor. Kaelen listened intently, gauging the time by the sound of the trains passing by, their mechanical wails piercing through smog and silence alike. He counted their cries, relentless and predictable, marking the time like a heartbeat. 3 trains always passed before the old man appeared. Never one more, never one less. It was an unspoken ritual, a pattern that defied the chaos, all the more suspicious for its regularity. Each time, Kaelen waited in his hiding place, a part of him anxious to see if the old man would return, another part dreading what might happen if he did. He told himself not to care, that it didn't matter, that his instincts knew better than to hope. But there he was, each day, every day, watching, waiting, feeling the hours stretch like steel wire between his ribs. When the footsteps finally came, Kaelen's body coiled tight and ready, not with fear, but with an anticipation that scared him even more. He could feel himself hollowing out with every passing second, his hunger like acid in the back of his throat, his breath held in disbelief until he saw the man's shadow cast against the crumbling walls. The old man appeared wearing the same clothes as if he had never left, never moved from the spot where Kaelen first saw him, as if he had been waiting in the alley, waiting for Kaelen to come back, waiting to begin the game again. He acted like the world outside that alley didn't exist, like nothing changed in the hollow, like he had all the time in the world. But the food was always different. It was never the same thing twice, never what Kaelen expected to find, never what he had convinced himself would be there. Some nights it was dried meat, tough and stringy, wrapped in old fabric and tucked carefully as if it were precious. Other nights it was a fruit, bruised and overripe, its skin barely holding together, the sweet smell biting at Kaelen's empty stomach. Sometimes the offering was a chunk of stale bread, hard enough to break teeth, or a half-eaten protein bar, its wrapper crumpled like it had been scavenged from trash before it had been left for him. Kaelen took what was given, but he did so, knowing it wasn't a gift. It was never enough for a full meal, just enough to keep him on the edge of survival, the edge of believing the man might come back again. Each night, Kaelen's stomach churned as he fought against the hope that gnawed more than the hunger ever could. 3 days went by, then 4, then 5. His thoughts mirrored the same patterns as his footsteps, looping back to the same questions, the same doubts. By the 6th, suspicion chewed through him so fiercely that it felt like another kind of starvation. Who was this man? Why was he doing this? No one in the hollow gave without taking. It was against the very nature of this place, and against the nature of everything Kaelen knew. The hollow didn't have saviors. It didn't have generosity. Nothing was free here. He couldn't keep doing this, waiting, hoping, living this half-life at the mercy of someone else's routine. This couldn't be his life, counting trains and shivering in shadows, trusting in nothing but the hope that a stranger's actions would match his expectations of them. It made him weak, made him dependent, made him something less than what he had fought so hard to become. The questions piled up faster than he could answer them, crowding out every other thought until one stood out with brutal clarity. What if the man didn't come back one day? He would die. This wasn't survival. It was waiting to starve. Kaelen felt something inside change, as much a decision as the first time he'd reached for the food, a breaking loose of everything he had convinced himself to believe. Tomorrow, he would follow the old man. He would find out who he was, what he wanted. He would learn why any of this was happening before it all slipped away.